I couldn't believe it. I was going to visit a famous archaeological dig at some place called Campsville. And while it wasn't Egypt, it was an adventure, like something out of Indiana Jones. It all started when I told my science teacher that I wanted to be taller than my older sister. My teacher encouraged me to work this idea of height into my science project on the history of food. She suggested I investigate how the food people ate affected their average height. So my teacher arranged for me to go on a special field trip to an archaeological site where Native Americans lived over 10,000 years ago. It was not easy to get to the site. We had to travel on this really beat-up bus.
All right, that's the end of the line, folks. The bus is broken down. We gotta walk. Oh, God. Come on.
Yeah. Surprise, surprise, surprise. I can't believe the bus broke down again. It's the fourth time this month.
Usually breaks down.
The trip was not exactly what I expected, but neither was this guy I met, Jake. At first, he got on my nerves.
They say this place is filled with bones. I can't wait to see them.
Look, if there are any bones here, we have no right to dig them up. If we do, we're no better than grave robbers.
Well, I'm sorry.
He had some wild idea that we shouldn't disturb bones, but that's what archaeology is all about, learning about our past. At first, I felt kind of weird. Everyone seemed to know what to do, but Tony, the site director, made me feel at home.
Well, I see you two have met. Why don't you come on over with me and I'll show you the site. This is Twin Ditch Site. It's a Native American archaeological site from about 10,000 years ago, a time archaeologists call the early Archaic period. The people who lived here were hunters and gatherers. They weren't farming yet. We think this is what you would call a base camp, where people would have come and lived for a period of time, maybe even built a structure or two, then send parties out who would go down to the river to fish or up into the uplands to hunt or maybe over to the forest to gather nuts. They would bring those food sources back here and process them. But because they were hunters and gatherers, they would continue to move to another spot and do the same thing. So they weren't here for a real long time.
Hey, Tony, we got something over here!
Looks like a point.
Right.
It's like a St. Charles.
I wonder if they just found bones.
I hope not.
Ooh, look at this hole.
Oh, wow,
it's a whole
one.
That's good. Yeah, it's a St. Charles. Look at that. All right.
They didn't find bones.
Man, that's a classic.
Still, everyone was excited. I didn't get it. It didn't look like that much to me. Then Tony showed us some of the other things they found at the site.
Here's that St. Charles point that we just found. We're very excited about this because this was a hunting tool used by Native Americans here at the site almost 10,000 years ago. They used this in their search for food. This was what they would go out and hunt deer with. These are deer bones. Anything that the people made and left behind, like this butchering tool, is an artifact. Sometimes we take artifacts that they've made and make replicas of them in order to understand how those tools were made and how long they lasted, how well they worked. These may look just like rocks to you, but they're nut processing tools. They would be used to grind nuts into a meal that they would then eat. This is a woodworking tool. It's a drill. Many times they would drill the end of a spear shaft in order to fit the point in tightly. This is an adze. It would be used to chop trees. Everything that the people used here was intended to help them survive. Most of what we're finding here at the site is some form of hunting tool or gathering tool. It was very important for these people to get good food. They had to have good tools to be able to get that good food from the environment.
This place is loaded with artifacts. I felt like a detective trying to figure out how the Native Americans lived.
Hey, I think we got something here.
I was surprised how much work the digging involved. We had to scrape the soil very carefully, and if we found something, we had to measure its exact place and write down the information so that we could study how the artifacts might have been used by the Native Americans.
Lift it.
All this got me so interested in the dig that I nearly forgot about the bones until Tony took us to a lab nearby. The lab looked really neat. There was stuff everywhere.
Why don't we see any bones at the site? I read all about this place and it's famous for bones.
Other digs in the area have encountered human bones. What's so important about the site that we just saw is that it's so old. It's over 10,000 years old. It's giving us a window into prehistory that we've never had before. Besides, excavating human bones and removing them from the sites is a very controversial issue.
But that's archaeology.
That's grave robbing.
That's the issue in a nutshell. But there is a lot you can learn from bones.
And using a casting of the largest leg bone, the femur, Tony showed us how to find out how tall the Native Americans were.
Before we start measuring, I'd like you to think about the artifacts that we found at the dig and what they might tell us about these ancient people. Based on the evidence, how do you think the average height of the early Archaic people compares to the average height of the people today?
How tall is the average man of today?
About 5'10".
But that's not all we need to know. We don't know how tall the ancient man's family was. We don't know very much about the kind of food he ate. So how am I supposed to guess how tall he was?
Very good, Sandy. You've identified two things that we need to think about before we can make our hypothesis, an educated guess. What was the first one?
How tall his parents were.
That's right, his whole family. When you're born, you inherit a set of genetic traits. Your blonde hair or your brown eyes, you inherited from one or both of your parents. It's a collection of possibilities, and everybody's genetic traits are slightly different. What was the second idea?
What did this guy eat?
And why is that important?
If you don't eat well, you won't make the most of your genes. You won't grow.
Good. Now it's time to put these two ideas, genetics and diet, together.
And Tony showed us how to reach a hypothesis on the height of the Native Americans. He told us to write down our thoughts on the height of the Native Americans' family and diet. This would help us answer the question, was this Native American shorter, taller, or about the same height as the average person is today?
Okay, go for it. Don't worry about right or wrong answers. Remember, it's your thinking that's important.
Now, if only I could come up with the right thinking. When Tony came back, all I could think of was, please don't let me be wrong. Or worse yet, don't let Jake be right.
You done? Good. Come on over here, all right? Jake, are you done? Good. Good. Okay, Sandy, family height first. Your guess is that this man's family would have been short because you think people grow taller with each generation, just as your parents are taller than your grandparents.
And my older brother is taller than my dad.
Now, for food, you think these people would have had trouble in winter in the early spring because there was less food available then. So your guess is that overall, these people would have been short.
I'm sure of it.
Jake, you think that Native American hunters and gatherers would have been big, strong people with lots of food around to eat. So your guess is that these people would have been tall.
That's right. Why should he be shorter? These people had to live off the land. That takes guts.
That takes skill. It's not the same thing as being tall.
Wait a minute, I thought you two had reached a truce. Now, I know you were both suspicious when I said right or wrong answers weren't important. What's important is that you thought about the evidence from the dig and you based your hypotheses on that evidence. That's the process we use in scientific thinking. Now, if I take a measurement from this casting, I can calculate that this man was 170 centimeters tall.
So, if I convert centimeters into feet, the ancient man would be 5 feet 7 inches. It can't be. That means he wasn't much shorter than the average man is today.
He's shorter than I thought he'd be.
We need to return to the evidence at the site. The evidence tells us that these people, as hunters and gatherers, relied almost totally on a wide variety of plants and animals for food. And this variety meant that they were able to get all the vitamins, minerals, and protein they needed.
So it sounds like these people had plenty to eat, and that made them taller.
They ate well when food was available, but remember, they had no food storage. As Sandy pointed out, sometimes by winter or early spring, food was scarce. The bones indicate that these people did have some health problems. For example, the early Native Americans could almost always count on being malnourished by April or May
because of food shortages.
But what I don't understand is, how could both Jake and I be right about the evidence and have a different hypothesis?
That's because both of you applied your personal experience to what the evidence told you. Sandy, you thought that early people would have been short because your brother is taller than your dad. And Jake thought that living off the land was tough, and tough means tall. With scientific thinking, you shouldn't try to force a conclusion. The data usually lead to more questions, and that's what's important.
Well, then I've got another question.
Good for you.
If each generation is getting taller, why weren't the people of 10,000 years ago a lot shorter? Did people start growing taller just recently? Or did people get shorter in between? And if so, why?
Those are good questions. But why don't we try to investigate a lifestyle between the early Archaic period and today? Let's try mid-19th century rural America.
And Tony sent Jake and me to a place with a lot of different houses for pioneer times.
Home. Come on in.
Boy, these guys must have been short.
This is a completely restored home of Norwegian settlers that came in the 1830s. They came because of religious persecution and the shortage of land in Norway. The long trip over by ship took 3 months, and they brought only 3 trunks with them like this. One was for tools, and one for clothes, and one for their food. And that's all they had when they came.
Everything looks so small. Were the people that lived in this house real short?
Well, the man that lived here was 5'1".
Was 5'1"
The average height?
No, the average height was 5'4".
But that's shorter than Native Americans.
And what did the settlers eat?
The evidence is all around you. Take a look.
What do they use these for?
Well, the animals were trapped in the winter, and the pelts were sold for extra income.
Is this what they ate out of?
Yes, that's all they had was one hand-carved bowl that they both ate out of with 2 hand-carved spoons.
What is this? It smells like sugar.
Well, it is sugar, but it was bought in a cone, and it was very expensive. And they only used it very sparingly. It might have even lasted a whole year.
What was this for?
Well, that's a pig pen. They kept the pigs in the house in the spring when they were young, so the animals didn't eat them.
Were these the only animals they had?
Well, later on, they would buy a cow when they became more prosperous.
To investigate why the settlers were shorter than the Native Americans, Jake and I agreed to use Tony's method again. We both wrote down our thoughts about the height of the settlers' family and their food resources. Then, we wrote our hypothesis on the question. Why were the settlers shorter than the Native Americans? I'm glad I wasn't born a pioneer girl. Life was a killer then. I'll never complain about doing the dishes again.
I can't believe every time they wanted water, they had to do it this way.
Me neither. It was amazing. Just about everything had to be done by hand. They didn't even have electricity, so there weren't stoves or refrigerators. People had to work very hard just to live.
Okay, let's hear your thoughts. Why were the settlers shorter than the early Archaic Native Americans?
I say that the settlers had different genetic traits than the Native Americans. As far as food, the settlers had one advantage over the Native Americans: farming. But they didn't have any refrigerators, so food storage was a problem.
And the settlers often ran short on food in the winter and into the spring.
Just like the Native Americans.
That's right, and food storage and preservation was a full-time job. Salting was a common way of preserving their meats. They often would put their meat in a salt brine here in a barrel just like this and keep it right in the house. After salting, they might take the meats and hams and hang them in a smokehouse, or they might dry them like beef jerky. Would last a long time. Apples and currants were air-dried. Often they would add sugar to the fruits, and that would preserve them. They might even make jellies and jams out of the fruits. Vinegar was another way of preserving their foods. They might pickle their vegetables, or even eggs were pickled. Ways of preserving food was very inadequate. They didn't have the modern ways of preserving food. Often the lids didn't seal and the food spoiled. They'd scrape off the mold and eat it anyway. Many times they'd have to brush off bird droppings and mouse droppings off of their dried fruits. They had to. There was nothing else to eat. They would starve.
I agree with Jake on the family height issue. And for food, I think that the settlers were short because their diets were so poor in Europe while they were growing up.
Good. It's true. The settlers in Europe had a very inadequate diet without much variety. They would boil grains and add milk, and that was a porridge they would eat. When they came to America, their diets improved somewhat. They would have salted meats and potatoes, but sometimes they had to eat that 3 times a day. They had very little variety.
But by the time their diets had improved, they were adults. It was too late to help them grow taller.
So it's even more important for Sandy and me to eat right.
Now that we're growing so much.
That's right. You want to grow as tall as your genetic traits allow.
Hey, maybe we're onto something. If we go back to the original question, can we say that the settlers were shorter than the Native Americans? Because their diet wasn't as good as the Native Americans' diet.
What else could it be?
What about the settlers' genetic traits?
We forgot genes. And genes affect height.
But we should remember what Tony told us. We shouldn't try and force a conclusion.
While their genetic traits were different, the Native Americans and early settlers had one thing in common, and that was their food. They had a subsistence diet. Do either of you know what that means?
Yeah, I know. They ate whatever food they had available to survive.
That's right. Food was survival. But they didn't have the variety of foods that we have today.
Does that mean that sometimes they didn't get all the nutrients they needed?
Yes, and they knew next to nothing about nutrition. Vitamins, minerals, and proteins were unknown until the 20th century.
So today, because you know more about nutrition and have a greater variety of foods, we're growing taller than ever before?
That's right, for those reasons and many more. But I'm not the one to ask those questions. You need to move into the 20th century for that.
And while Jake and I were still on a farm, the change of scene was like night and day. Here we met Dr. Merkel, an animal scientist at a university research farm.
While farming has been going on for thousands of years, that doesn't mean that it hasn't changed. It has changed, along with people's taste in food.
I knew that farming has changed. Farmers today have better tractors and equipment, and that's made farming much more productive.
Better equipment is only part of the reason that farmers in the U.S. are the most productive in the world. Technology is the other part. It has made great improvements in the production and the quality of food plants. Research has led to the development of grains, such as this wheat, that can grow in the arid climates, the more hardy and nutritious rice, and feed grains to produce leaner livestock.
Lean beef. That's what my mom looks for when she goes to the supermarket.
Most people prefer lean beef. Over the last 10 years, our research has focused on selective breeding to make cattle grow faster and become leaner. For example, in this heifer, we have increased the muscle approximately 10% and decreased the fat approximately 25%.
But why do people want leaner beef?
They want leaner beef because
No sooner
it's
had I
healthier
asked
for
the
them.
question, and Jake and I were whisked away to a supermarket where we met a food technologist. She explained lean beef in everyday language.
Thank you. Lean beef has less fat and it provides many essential nutrients. So, moderate portions of beef fit well in a balanced diet.
Balance? That always sounded so dull. Where's the excitement, the spice?
We're talking about the same thing. Because no single food provides all the nutrients our bodies need, then balance means eating a variety of foods. And you know what they say about variety.
It's the spice of life.
And now you can have your spice and eat it too. Because we've got a greater variety of food to choose from than ever before in history. All thanks to food technology. Come on, let me show you what I mean. Technology lets you enjoy better, safer foods. Take milk, for example. Today we heat or pasteurize it to kill disease-causing bacteria, making it completely safe to drink. Infected foods accounted for more than 25% of all disease outbreaks as late as 1938.
My grandmother must remember that. She was my age then.
Then you can also ask her about the nutritional deficiency disease pellagra. In 1938, cases of this deadly disease numbered in the thousands. But by 1945, after food technologists enriched breads and cereals with the B vitamin niacin, pellagra had virtually disappeared.
I never knew how much technology went into producing food. I always took the supermarket for granted. And I was glad we studied the early archaic Native Americans and the 19th century settlers. Jake and I both learned a lot about asking questions, gathering scientific data, making a hypothesis, and reaching a conclusion. By investigating the connection between people's food and their height, we learned that even though a person's height is determined by many factors, diet plays an important role. For example, the early archaic people ate a variety of animal and plant foods, and that may have helped them grow almost as tall as we are today. On the other hand, the 19th century European settlers' limited diet may have made them shorter. Today, thanks to food technology, we can choose from over 100,000 food products in the supermarket. Products like leaner meats, enriched or fortified breads and cereals, fresh fruits and vegetables, and pasteurized low-fat dairy products. With that variety of food and our understanding of nutrition, how can we not make the most of our genes for height?
Yeah, that nutritionist is cool.
Yeah.
What about this, Jake? Could it be that agriculture was the reason that